to my channel, Edible Thoughts Makes. My name is Stephanie, and this channel is where I share with you my works in progress, finished projects, things I'm cooking up, books I'm reading, funny things the kids say. My hope is that as you watch this episode and the previous episodes that you find some inspiration along the way. It is July 2020, and today I'd actually like to share with you some of my thoughts on how I pick a pattern to knit or to crochet. Hello, so I just wanted to say that while I was recording this, there were several interruptions and just noise going on in the kitchen by the kids. So there were several starts and stops. And then in my frustration, I think there were multiple segments that I thought I had recorded, but the video camera was actually just on standby and not record. So then when it turned off is when I realized that it wasn't recording at all. So I apologize for some things that may seem choppy. And I hope the information that I wanted to record all got in there. One thing I did want to mention that I think got cut off was that my different points that I look at for evaluating a pattern, the way I've listed them out to talk about is not necessarily a priority list, as in like one gets weighted more than another. It just ends up being that I look at all these factors to decide how I approach a pattern or if I decide to skip it. So my hope for you is that as you watch this episode, that it will inspire you to make things the way you want to, using resources and tools that you have or the ones that you want to acquire, and that it gets you excited about tapping into your creative energies to make something that you are really happy and excited about. And if the end result is not something you're happy and excited about, I hope that it is a great learning experience that can help you make future things as well, and equip you with information on how to keep making things your own. So enjoy! I thought I would share with you some of the questions I ask myself, things I'm looking for, and when I get started, how I go through the process if I am using a different yarn than what the pattern calls for. It may just be switching it out for a different brand, but it could also be a different yarn weight. It could be requiring different needle sizes. And how do I do that and still make the size, or hope to make the size that I am planning to make? So let's get started. So usually when I look at a pattern, I will be drawn to it based on maybe the fit of it or pictures. So pictures are really important to me because I need to be able to see it, to be drawn to it, and think of how it might fit into what I am looking for. And then once I am drawn to something, I will check sizing options because I need to see if it's in the size that I want to make it in. And I am also interested in how many sizes are offered. Is this a size inclusive designer? Do they factor in ease when they are looking at sizes? So ease, if you're not familiar with that, there's positive ease and negative ease. Positive ease is any extra width that you have in a garment compared to your chest circumference. And negative ease would be any number that would be less than your chest circumference. So you would either have a garment that's a little looser fitting, or if there's zero ease, then it would be the same measurement as your chest circumference. Or if it was negative ease, then there would be definitely stretch to it and it would be closer fitting. So depending on what you're looking for, sometimes the designer will put in their pattern that this pattern is designed to be worn with 4 to 6 inches of positive ease. And then you would pick your size accordingly, and hopefully it would be clear in there that the measurements they give are either for a certain chest circumference or they are the finished measurement numbers. So that's something that I look for, and I hope is clear, because if it isn't, then I could be picking the wrong size for what I want to make. And then that would be a surprise as I'm making it, or at the end when it doesn't fit. So yes, I look at the sizing options. I look at what kind of yarn is used. So, and particularly looking at yarn weight. So let's say I am looking for like a lighter weight sweater for the summer, or a cardigan or something. Well, then I probably don't want to pick one that is going to use bulky yarn, and I probably want to look for something that is DK weight or less. If you aren't familiar with different yarn weights, I need to look down at my notes here. The CraftyYarnCouncil.com, and I'll put the link either up here or definitely down below in the show notes. I do use the description box section for linking various resources and mentioning what I talk about, so definitely check that box below. So yarn weights, they do come in numbers and like a word category. So starting from the finest weight, you have lace weight, which is usually 0. And the way it's determined is you look at your gauge. So your gauge is calculating how many stitches per inch fit, like in an inch or in 2 inches. And then you're also looking at rows or rounds to see your vertical gauge and your horizontal gauge, because that you're making a fabric. Whether you're crocheting or knitting, you're going to be making a fabric, and your gauge will depend on everything. What needle size you use, what material you're using, your own tension, so that can vary by person. So sorry, going back to the numbers. So you have 0 as lace weight, and that can include like mohairs or just very thin yarns. Then you will have number 1, which is your super fine yarns, so your sock weight yarns, your fingering weight yarns. And then category 2 is sport weight, so that's a little heavier than your fingering weight yarns. Level 3 is your DK weight, or also sometimes called light worsted. 4 is your worsted weight, and sometimes heavier worsted is Aran weight yarn. Level 5 is your chunky yarns. Level 6 is your super bulky yarns, and level 7 is considered like jumbo, or sometimes they'll call it roving yarns. So knowing what weight of yarn you are looking for, or what you have in hand, or what you're looking at a store, really affects what kind of product you are going to make. So knowing your yarn categories can be really so you want to know your yarn categories. Now, that being said, can you use a 4mm needle only for a certain type of yarn? No. Depending on what size of needle you use, that'll change the density of your fabric. So if you use a smaller size needle, you'll have a denser fabric. If you use a bigger size needle, you'll have a looser fabric. So sometimes if you want a drapier or looser fabric, you're going to use a bigger size needle with possibly a smaller weight of yarn. Whereas if you are maybe knitting socks and you're going to use that small fingering sock weight yarn, you're going to want to use a smaller needle, because usually you don't look for like a drapey, loose gauge in socks because they won't fit very well. But then let's say you're knitting a shawl or something, a lot of times you want a shawl to be kind of looser and drapier, so you might still use fingering or sock weight yarn, but use a needle size that is like a US 5 or US 6 or US 7. So that's something that you think about, or I think about, when I am looking at patterns. So it's important to me that a pattern lists out their yarn approximate yarn. It's important to me that a pattern lists out their yardage and their gram estimations for a project. And for each size, because I want to know if I have yarn available already that can make this pattern. I want to know if I have to go purchase something, and I need it to help me make a decision if I change out the yarn, how that affects the yardage and the weight of yarn, amount of yarn that I need. Now this is information that I'm talking about. It's not like I prioritize one over another. These are just all factors that help me decide if this is a pattern that I am interested in going through with. And also, I find this information I need before I purchase or start a pattern, whether it's a free pattern or a pay-for pattern, because this is information that I need before I start a project to know if it's even feasible. Photos for a project are always helpful, especially if it's a garment. I want to see it on different body types. I want to see how people style it. I want to see if it's something that's going to be of interest to me, and be wearable. Like, can I see myself wearing it, or whoever I'm gifting it to wearing the garment or the accessory? So I also look for techniques that are involved in the pattern. So are they techniques that I already know? Is there anything new that I'm going to learn? And is there anything that I just don't want to tackle yet? So, for example, for shawls, I mostly look for ones that primarily are in garter stitch. If there's some lace, that's okay. I have not yet tackled the brioche technique yet. It is on my list of things to learn, but it's just not something that I am interested in doing right now. I will say that, like, in the past, I basically omitted any pattern that used an I-cord edging, and now that I have learned it, I realize that it is definitely not scary at all and can provide such a beautiful finish to any garment or accessory. Next, I look for the tools that I might need. So are there needles or hooks that I don't have that I need to obtain? Are there specialty tools that I might need to have or find or something? So those would affect whether or not I decide to make a particular pattern or not. Now, I've looked through all that stuff, and none of it is prioritized above the others, so it just kind of depends on how it all fits together. And let's say I decide I probably want to make this. So then I need to look at what type of yarn is used and if I plan on using that same yarn or not. If it is yarn that I have already and in the colors that I see coming together and that's what I want to make it out of, then I just go ahead and but let's say I don't have that yarn and I want to use something else instead. How am I going to make that happen? So then you want to look at the gauge that's in the pattern. Now, gauge will tell you stitches and rows or rounds. So how many stitches fit in a row given 2 inches or 4 inches, and then same for the vertical part. So I will say the majority of the time I do not do a gauge swatch because it might not matter, or I might just decide to go for it and see what happens. So for example, like, let's say it's a garment that has the sizing where it's like 4 inches between each size. Now, if I'm between sizes, I may not really care too much if it airs 1 or 2 inches on each side. So then I might just pick one that I think fits my mood or something like that. But a gauge swatch can really tell you a lot. So it can tell you about your fabric density, it can tell you about drapiness. So I have done several swatches in the past, and a lot of them are for test knits or just for maybe checking color, like combinations together, but I find that a swatch can really tell you a lot. That being said, a swatch can also lie, because I have had knit swatches that I'm like, okay, I think this is it, and then when I finish, just by the weight of the garment or how it's blocked or just wear, the gauge can change. So I wouldn't say that I feel like a gauge swatch is always necessary, but it does give you more information to help you make whatever decision you are making about making your garment. So you can see here, I put little tags on all of mine, and that gives me information about my swatch. So I will write on there the yarn that I used, the fiber content, the needle size I used, and then whatever gauge I came out. So like if it's 24 stitches by 32 rows, things like that. I find that my gauge is pretty similar, flat, knit flat, or in the round, so I tend to do the majority of my swatches flat. But for some people, just the way they knit or purl can change how their tension is. So if a project is going to be knit in the round, you probably want to do your swatch in the round to get your best approximation of what your fabric is going to be like. Let's say you picked a project where it is in fingering weight and you decide that you want to do it in worsted weight. So it's going to affect your fabric density, right? So like if you're going to go from fingering weight, so like this swatch is done with sock weight yarn, heavier sock weight yarn, but do you see how like dense it is? This one, let's see, I don't have a worsted weight one here. I think I have DK weight. But see how you can see the stitches more on this? It also uses a bigger size needle. So you're gonna have to do some math. So let's say your initial density is like gonna be like this. Think of each one as like stitches. Now you're gonna switch it to bigger needles and bigger yarn. So you're gonna have, let's say your gauge is 24 stitches over 4 inches. And let's say the size for that in the pattern is a cast on of 120 stitches. Oh, by the way, so by this point you have purchased or obtained the pattern, so you know how many cast on stitches you're going to have. Because typically that information isn't on like a pattern preview. You'll have the gauge, but not like the number of stitches that you're going to be casting on for a particular project. So let's say you have, no, let's go back. So let's say you have 24 stitches for 4 inches. And let's say for the size that you picked, it's going to be a cast on of 120 stitches. Now if you do the math, you're going to calculate out how many stitches is however many inches or centimeters for the circumference. Let's say we're making a hat for the circumference you want. So let's say if it's a 20-inch circumference hat and your cast on is 120 stitches and your gauge is 24 stitches by 4 inches, and now you want to go to a bigger size needle and a heavier weight yarn, but you still want a 20-inch circumference. So let's say your gauge is now 20 stitches over 4 inches. So if you do the math, and I'll show it here, it ends up being 100 stitches for your cast on and not 120 stitches. Now that can give you so much information because now you can hopefully still follow the pattern if the repeats or whatever texture is divided up in a way that you can adjust it to fit to your new number that you just calculated. So you may need to go up or down a few stitches here or there, but you might be able to make it work for the circumference that you want. Keep in mind that fiber content can also affect how your pattern or how your fabric may end up. So depending on the content of your fabric, you may have something drapier or less drapey. It might wear better over time, it might not, it might pill more, it might not. The washing is going to be different. So those are all things to keep in mind when you switch things up. So it's not saying you can't, it's just saying that there's a lot of information to think about as you create something, as you make things. Something to keep in mind along the lines of that is wool often will has memory, so it kind of like bounces back, whereas cotton tends to like elongate or like stretch out over time, so that may affect your fabric as it's worn. So even if you do like a little gauge swatch, it might not tell you all of that because it's not like hanging on a body or being worn or pulled around or anything, or on a head and being stretched out. But over time, that will change. So I hope this information has been useful, and I hope it empowers you to look at patterns in a way that help you make it your own. So cheers to being creative. Happy making!